Amazing. Great. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Katrin Heitmann. Dr. Heitmann received her PhD from the Technical University of Dortmund. Then she joined Los Alamos National Laboratory as a researcher until 2011, when she moved to Argonne, where she's currently a deputy division director of high energy physics. Her research revolves around large-scale computer simulations of the universe, which can be leveraged to understand the contents and evolution of our universe. Among other honors, she is an elected fellow of the American Physical Society and a former spokesperson of the Legacy Survey of Space and Time Dark Energy Science Collaboration. So please join me in welcoming Katrin.
Thanks very much. I am extremely excited to actually be here and delivering this keynote speech to you. I want to talk about exploring the dark universe, and I'm talking to you a little bit about the physics of the dark universe. Then about the HACK story. So HACK is the cosmology code that we're actually using to simulate the universe, and preparing for new cosmological data. And some of you here in the room are actually part of the Legacy Survey of Space and Time that I will discuss in a little bit more detail. And also, I mentioned already HACK, the Hardware Hybrid Accelerated Cosmology Code. So that is our code to simulate the universe. And so the name describes the code quite nicely, HACK. Management sometimes is not so happy and calls it HHCC to make it sound more serious, but really HACK is what we have. Before I start, I want to thank my collaborators. And the one thing I would like to point out here is that we have a very diverse set of collaborators between physics, computer science, and statistics. And especially at the national labs, it's always a great opportunity to really connect with these different disciplines and really build a great collaboration. One thing I will talk quite a little bit about is LSST DESC, the Dark Energy Science collaboration. So I listed here. And the other thing that I want to point out is Isabelle Vittori, who is here, and she is applying for grad school, and she is applying to the University of Michigan. She's very interested in computing. So please take a look at her application when it comes in. Modern cosmology is actually the story of making maps of the sky in multiple wavelengths. So in physics in general, what you do is you do an experiment, you have a specific thing that you want to investigate. But with the universe, what we are doing is we actually are observing it. I will tell you a little bit how you can build your own little universe on a supercomputer. But in general, what we do is we observe it, and we observe it in different wavelengths. So here you see a map of the X-ray sky from ROSAT, of the microwave sky. It's still WMAP. We have newer maps now, but I like it because it's round, so it fits nicely in the picture. From the Gamma Ray Survey Fermi, and optical data from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which is down here. It's a telescope that still exists in New Mexico. And since I was at Los Alamos for a long time, I really like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey still a lot. What we do with these maps is we do statistical analysis. So we measure fluctuations in them, we measure the correlations of the fluctuations. And from that, we derive information about the content of the universe, about the evolution of the universe, the physics of the universe. Therefore, it is really a statistical inverse problem that we have to solve. So we go from the sky maps to scientific inference. And as you can imagine, we need very good predictions for that. And I think it's clear to say that cosmology cannot exist without large-scale computing in these days. And this is what I want to talk to you about in the next hour or so. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor, I'm a theorist, but I always like to show some pretty data. So this is from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. It's old data, but it still shows the beauty of these surveys. So what we are doing here is we are zooming into a specific place here in the universe. And what you see is two galaxies are actually colliding. And so you see all the detail that we have here. And in the simulations, we want to capture as much of the details as possible. So we want to capture the very large volumes that we observe with these surveys, but we also want to capture as much detail of its ingredients. So I always find this, so this was done by David Hawk from NYU. And it really gives you an idea of the scales that we want to cover with our simulations. And just to put a little bit of context in, so I'm going to talk about optical surveys that take images of galaxies and spectra of galaxies. And then just to give you a little bit of an idea about the size of what we are talking about. So we love to measure things in megaparsec or gigaparsec. And a parsec is 3.26 light years or 31 trillion kilometers. And the surveys, they cover roughly volumes of 4 GPC cubed, or 12 billion light years in linear scale. The number of galaxies in these surveys can be in the tens of billions. So we have a lot of galaxies, and the typical intergalactic separation of the galaxies is a megaparsec. The typical galaxy mass, I'm talking a lot in this talk about masses, is 10 to the 11 to 10 to the 13 solar masses, another number to keep in your mind. And the typical size of a galaxy is 100 kiloparsec. So what you see here is we go from gigaparsec to megaparsec to kiloparsec. And we have roughly a range, if we want to resolve what we see in the galaxy, of 10 to the 6 that we then also have to cover in our simulations. So it's really a daunting task, what we have set out to do here. What have we learned so far from these surveys? We have learned quite a bit. So this is cosmology, like in 2 slides. It's much too quick, of course, but at least I want to give you a little bit of a flavor. So we have learned that there's a dark energy. Roughly 70% of the matter content in the universe is made up of dark energy, and it was discovered for the first time in 1998, and the Nobel Prize was given for it in 2011. Imagine you throw a ball in the air, and instead of it coming down, it goes accelerated into space and faster and faster. So the question that we are trying to answer is, what is it? Why is it important now? Like it could have been, if we would have lived a few billion years earlier, we would not have seen it. And currently, what we are trying with our surveys to do is to characterize better what the properties are of this dark energy. The second very big component, 27% of the matter energy content, is dark matter. So we call it dark matter because it doesn't absorb or it's light. And again, we have no real clue what the nature of dark matter is. We have detected it indirectly by bending the light around big masses in the universe. But again, what we want to do is we want to know what is actually, what kind of particle is it? And we are building very large detectors to capture it and really study it in more detail. But so far, we have not been able to detect it directly. So 95% of the universe is dark. We do not understand the nature and the origin of dark energy matter. And we use 5% is the visible matter and only 0.5% is in stars. And we are trying from this 0.5% in stars to really learn a lot about the universe. The second part that we have made quite a bit of progress on is about the evolution of the universe. So we have a solid understanding of structure formation. And so basically what we know by now is that we have a set of initial conditions. It's actually Gaussian primordial fluctuations. And we have measured these with a cosmic microwave background, which you see here in this picture at the very top. Then these initial perturbations are amplified by gravitational instability in the dark matter dominated universe. And the relevant theories that we have is general relativity, field theory, and atomic physics, really first principle physics. And we can evolve our universe from initial conditions forward and see what happens. And so here in this cartoon from NASA, you see that we first have the area very early on in the universe, then structure formation starts, and down here we have the galaxies that we observe today. So the latter half of this history that I'm showing you here is actually the nonlinear domain of structure formation. And again, we need simulations to capture this. These simulations start relatively early on, 50 million years after the Big Bang. And this is when the universe was still kind of linear and we can write down things on a piece of paper. And then we evolve it forward on a supercomputer, and we'll get into that in much more detail later on. So these were kind of like 2 slides about cosmology. And we are calling this a standard model of cosmology. So we describe the evolution as well as the composition of the universe. And we cast this in a handful of parameters. So these parameters are omega lambda, which tells us how much dark energy there is, so 0.7 in what I told you before. Omega matter, which measures how much cold dark matter is in the universe and how many baryons. We have the dark energy equation of state that we want to measure. We call it W. Right now, our understanding is that it's very close to our measurement shows us that it's very close to -1. And we have the initial fluctuations that I told you that really sets our, the initial conditions in the universe, which is a spectral index, which we named NS, which describes the shape of the initial fluctuations, the slope actually, and sigma 8, which gives you the amplitude. And then there's the Hubble parameter that we also measure. And this describes, the Hubble parameter describes the expansion of the universe. So with just this handful of parameters, we have actually a very, very good description of the universe, which is quite exciting. So let's take a very quick look at where we are at right now. So this is an image from 2021 from Heitmann et al. And what I'm showing you here is the measurement of omega m, the meta density, versus sigma 8, the meta fluctuation amplitude. And as I told you at the start, we have these different maps that we use to actually make measurements of the universe. And what you see here a little bit is, so you have these different colors, they are from different surveys. So the green is the cosmic microwave background measurement. Yellow is an imaging survey. Purple is the joint constraint from an imaging and a spectroscopic survey. And what you see is that all these ellipses are kind of consistent, but not 100%. There's a 3 sigma discrepancy actually. And so what we want to do now, and this is just one set of parameters that I'm listing here. What we want to do now is get a better understanding. So if we get more data and better modeling with these ellipses, which will shrink, hopefully, will they move apart or will they move together? And we have still a fully consistent description of our universe with these parameters. Or is there new physics that we have to do? Like, for example, if the early time ellipse moves out a little bit, will we see some new physics? Right now, the bet is on that they all will come together with better modeling and more data. And that's what I want to talk about in the following. More data, where do we get it from? And simulations. Where are we at with those? How good are they? And what can we learn from them? So more data. So this is a picture of the Rubin Observatory. It's currently being built in Chile. It will carry out a 10-year survey. It's called the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, LSST. And it will observe half of the sky and record 37 billion stars and galaxies. So this is really, really a very impressive survey. We are hoping that we will have system first light in 2025 and the first release of 1-year data in 2027, 2028. We will also have 10 million alerts each night, 20 terabytes of data each night. So we have to do something with that data. And the Rubin Observatory has a very, very large camera, which weighs more than 3 tons and will produce images so large that you would need 1,500 high definition TV screens to view each of them. So it's a very, very impressive survey. And we are all very much looking forward for it to start taking data. And this is an image from last year where you see the dome of the telescope actually. A little bit more detail. So the red area here that you see is the area of the southern sky that LSST will observe. It will be roughly 18,000 to 20,000 square degrees of the southern sky. So details are still being fine-tuned. There will be also deep drilling field where the telescope will just stare for much, much longer. So you get a much deeper image of the universe. And you see that in these little blue dots here. What we did as part of our collaboration, and I will talk about this much, much more, is we simulated a patch of the sky. And Humna, who's here in the audience, actually, she worked a lot on the observing strategy for this patch. And you see it here in green. So I will talk a little bit more about that in this talk. And in addition to this static sky, where the telescope will look, will take lots of images of galaxies, we will also have these worldwide alerts every night. So if you are interested, everybody at a US institution can actually join the Rubin family, and you can have these nightly alerts on your phone and decide if you want to have a telescope that follows up on you. There will be also annual data releases, images, objects, and source tables that we can then use to do our science. So in order to make the best use of the science, 8 science collaborations have been formed. And I'm a member of the Dark Energy Science Collaboration, or DESC, and it is supported by the Department of Energy, the High Energy Physics office. And here you see a bunch of us at a collaboration meeting at SLAC earlier this year. And we also have hack weeks, and we had one here actually at the University of Michigan last year, where we get together for 1 week and just do a lot of work together. Overall, the collaboration has more than 1,200 members all over the world. So you see here a little bit, the biggest contingency in the US, but also a lot in Europe and other countries. So we are trying to prepare as good as possible for this data set to come online and to then do the dark energy science with it. So our approach is that we are using 5 complementary cosmology probes, so we can measure how the galaxies cluster. I showed you these maps, so you can measure their clustering properties. We will use supernovae, exploding stars, to also constrain cosmology, and also weak and strong lensing. I don't have enough time to go into the details here because I want to get to the simulations. But these are the standard probes that we use to constrain cosmology. Our challenges will be to understand the data itself, as well as to be able to model it in enough detail. And I will come back to that. We have a set of requirements in order to measure the properties of dark energy at a certain level of accuracy. They're described in the science requirements document. And our plan right now is to use simulated data challenges to really get ready for the survey. The ellipse here that you see is constrained on the dark energy equation of states. So the one thing that you can do is you can say, I give it a time varying component. So that is here the evolution on the y-axis, and then the dark energy equation of state, the constant piece on the x-axis. And you see differently colored ellipses, which means that we use these different probes that we have. We produced one constraint, what we think we will do with this data if we understand it properly. And then you can also combine all these probes. So the smallest ellipse that you see in the center is what we hope we will get after 1 year of data taking. And remember, the survey is 10 years as a constraint for the dark energy. After 10 years, our constraints hopefully will be very, very good. And all of this will happen if we understand our data well enough. So this brings me to the simulation. So as you can imagine, in order to understand the data, you need predictions, and these predictions we are trying to produce with large-scale simulations. And here I want to tell you a little bit about the HACK story. So HACK is our simulation code that computes the universe. What we are assuming is gravity dominates on the larger scales, and we use a Monte Carlo sampling algorithm to actually do our simulations. You see here the equations that we are solving. So the first one is the equation of motion for tracer particles in an expanding universe. So I talked about the Hubble parameter before. So the A dot over A describes the expansion of the universe. And then you also have the components, the CDM component, the cold dark matter component, and the baryons in the second equation, and the dark energy. And then you need to solve the Poisson equation to put it all together that you see in the third equation. So this is a set of equations that we solve on the supercomputer. We are using tracer particles to describe the dark matter in the universe. And the one important thing is that we want to, as I said at the beginning, we want to simulate an as large volume of the universe as possible. At the same time, we want to be able to really resolve the structures in the universe. So if you look at this one, so the particle mass in my simulation should be as small as possible so that I resolve all the structures in the universe that I have. The volume should be really large. And therefore, the number of particles that I want to simulate has to be also very large. At smaller scales that I'm not going to discuss here much in detail, we also have gas physics. And then things become really, really complex. So down here, you see the evolution. I told you at the beginning that we have smooth initial conditions at very early times. Then the gravitational instability pulls on these small fluctuations, pulls them together, and structure starts forming. And this is how this looks, the structure today. So what you again see here is the tracer particle of the dark matters that we simulated. One quote that I always like to show here on the slide is that in 1969, Bob Dickey said the universe is far too complicated a structure to be studied deductively, starting from initial conditions, solving the equations of motion. But this is exactly what we do. We start from initial conditions, we are solving the equations of motion, and we study then the structure that we get today. So the hack story started at Los Alamos. So you heard that I was a staff member at Los Alamos at some point. And the machine that you see here is a machine that was called Roadrunner. And in 2007, we got a message from Andy White, who was responsible for computing at Los Alamos, saying, what would you do if you would have a petaflop of compute power? And so in that time, the petaflop barrier was kind of like the holy grail of supercomputing. So it had not been broken. And Andy White had this idea, or was pushing the idea of building Roadrunner, a machine that would achieve petaflop performance via cell accelerators. You probably have not heard about cell accelerators, and the reason is that they don't exist anymore. But for Roadrunner, that was the idea how to get the performance. And you can see immediately the parallels to GPUs today. And so the challenge was that the machine had, for that time in 2008, kind of crazy architecture. And actually, Andy White would have said it was forward-looking, it was not crazy. And it required a major code rewrite and redesign. So we had a cosmology code at that time, but there was no way that it was used accelerators. So the question was, what do you do? Do you take your current code and redesign it, or do you write a new code? And Gus would have said, no, you just take somebody else's code and don't even worry about it. But we were a little bit more adventurous, and we decided to write a new code. And so the one thing that we knew was that Roadrunner was probably one of a kind. So we wanted to write a code, design a code that was easily ported to other architectures later on. So that was very, very important for us. The other thing that I didn't really say, but I should have said, is that at Los Alamos, so Los Alamos is a national security lab, and the big supercomputers are usually classified. So they are for the weapons people. So having this machine in the open for a few months was a very, very big deal. And so again, Los Alamos management was kind of really nice to us basic scientists. And they said, we give you some resources to develop the code for the machine. We give you access to this machine. It will be only you and 5 other teams on this for a few months, and you can do science on this. And cosmologists are poor and always up for a challenge. So we said, yes, we want to do that. And the outcome actually was, first it was called MC3, a mesh-based cosmology on the cell, based on our previous code, which was a high-performance Fortran code, which I really, really actually liked. And it later became then Hack. So this one is just for fun. So every morning I read Die Süddeutsche, and Roadrunner was actually mentioned in that newspaper. And my colleagues always make fun of me because Germans like to make very long words. And you see here one Atombombenexplosion. I don't think I have to translate that. The other thing is that in German, we give everything a gender. And so this article starts with, he is the fastest calculator in the world. If you have ever been one of the first people on a new supercomputer, you know they don't work. If you have something that is he, cursing it is much easier. So I like that too. But it also mentioned in this article cosmology. So that was very nice. And the German newspaper said it leads by example. And again, we will come back to this, that the code that we developed actually was really well designed for GPUs for the future. And so we started thinking, crazy architecture, how can we use it? And the computer scientists are much more like very excited. Exascale is the future. In 2008 was also the year when an exascale report came out. And so yeah, let me spend like a couple of minutes about Roadrunner. Even though it doesn't exist anymore, rest in peace, Roadrunner. Here is the architecture in a cartoon. So what do we have here? We have in blue, where you see the 16 GB, these are the opterons. This is just like our CPUs that we all really like a lot and that we like to use. In Roadrunner, they had very little compute, 5% of the total compute, but half of the memory. And if you remember when I showed you this computing slide of the universe, I said, we want to have as many particles in the simulation as possible to get a lot of resolution. Therefore, we need a lot of memory. Each of these particles has position, velocity, and a tag. So the more particles we have, the more memory we need. The cells, which you see there in pink, up hanging off each of the opterons, actually also had on Roadrunner a lot of memory. So half the memories were sitting in the cells. They were 5 to 100 times faster than the CPU part of the machine. But as you can see, they're not directly connected, right? So in order to communicate what's happening on one of these cells, you have to always go through the opteron layer back. So you have to take that into account when you design your code, that you can't talk directly between the cell operations. Another thing that really was challenging was that the cells had their own language. So again, GPUs, you can connect to that. So it was called cell intrinsics. So what we wanted was to create something that, since we knew the cells wouldn't exist for a long time, that was an easy algorithm, so that we didn't have somebody spending a lot of time thinking about how to do the compute. So just again to summarize, so the challenges that we had was the opterons, which were slow, had half of the memory, so we had to use them in a good way. The opterons, what was nice or is nice about them, they had the normal programming paradigm. So you could program them in C, C++, or even Fortran. But the computer scientists who work with us refused to design a new code in Fortran. And MPI for communication between the different nodes. The cells also had a lot of memory, but it was slow to communicate between them. But on the other hand, they had 95% of the machine's compute power, and a new language was required. So what we wanted to have was something that took advantage of the memory on the cells and on the opterons, gives the cells a lot to do because it had a lot of compute power. Communication should be limited. And we wanted to make sure that the cell part was easy to code, so that if we had actually a postdoc who worked on this, and he wouldn't be too sad that if he said like 2 years later, like, okay, it's not working anymore, we have to replace it. So it was not too much work. The outcome was the following. So the first thing is, so here you see again a simulation, and you see it subdivided into a 3D, well, you see a 2D composition, but you can imagine it's a 3D composition of the whole volume of the simulation. And what we did was, and this is actually already common in cosmology code, we split it up into a long-range force and a short-range force solver. And the short-range force solver is the one that lives on the cells, and it has a lot of work to do. We wanted a very easy algorithm, but remember the universe lives across this whole area, so that was what the long-range force solver took care of. So that was a particle mesh solver. It was written in C, C++, MPI, and therefore it was living on the opterons. Then the short-range solver, that we said, okay, it can depend on the node architecture. So for the cells, it was a very easy algorithm, just an n-squared algorithm, so that you quickly could do a force calculation between the particles on the cell. And then what was very important was that we have this overlay in between these different nodes. So we have a passive and an active zone on each node so that the different nodes can talk to each other. So again, all the communications that needed to be done lived on the opterons, all the heavy duty calculational part lives on the cells. And we could replace the cell algorithm very easily. So we can take it out. If you actually look at the code, 95% of the code lives on the long-range solver on the CPUs, and only 5% lives on the GPUs. However, the computation that is done on the GPUs is the bulk of what needs to be computed on the cells. But yeah, you can see that. So it worked really, really well. We got a couple of papers from Roadrunner, and now we had a code that we could actually use and port forward to other architectures. This is just, again, for fun. So this is a snapshot when I was there at Los Alamos, sitting in my office. So you see here me running one job on the full machine. So it was kind of cool that for the first time in my life, I was working on a very fast machine and I could love myself. That was kind of nice. I put here a picture of somebody on the phone. That was the other interesting thing. So again, Los Alamos, the machine was in the classified area. And so even though it was on the open network, so otherwise I couldn't have connected, I could not directly go there and talk to people. So I was actually literally sitting on the phone and telling them, the machine is hanging, something is not good, can you take a look? So it was really, it was quite an experience. Here you just see the short range solver, the time speed up. So this would have been if we went on the opterons, and that was 100 speed up from the cells. So that worked out really well. Weak scaling plots, they are just, they just show that the long range solver actually worked as expected. So the code was doing well on Roadrunner. We wrote a couple of papers, and let's put this together. So what we have is now we have nice code. We know the constituents of the universe. We have the dynamical rules of the universe. We have the initial conditions, and with Roadrunner we have a very big machine. And so we can look at the structure formation of the universe. So this is a movie of the kind of images that I showed you before. We start with this very smooth initial density field, and then you see the structures forming over time. So this is what in cosmology, our redshift, which is time variable. And so you can see here all of these structures are forming. We are zooming in now to something around here where you see all these what we call halos are forming that will then host the galaxies. I will talk about this a little bit more. And so you have a large scale structure simulation. Yes.
Is this spatially periodic?
Yes. And in this movie, you wouldn't see it because it's just a little cutout of the full box, because otherwise you wouldn't see the details. But yeah, it's very good. Let's give this one. Okay, actually, this one just says that besides the code itself, we also had to develop a lot of analysis tools because running the simulation is one thing, analyzing the simulation is another thing. The simulation, the analysis tools have to scale as much as the code itself. So we worked a lot on that as well. And now you can explore actually different scenarios, right? You can take out the dark energy and see how your structure formation varies. So that's the middle panel. So you see many more structures form. The colors are actually the velocities of the particles. Or you can change your dark matter. You can make it a little bit warm so things get pulsed out a little bit. So now you really have an experimental tool that you can use and explore all your assumptions about cosmology and for what models. So that's really nice. So the hack story then continued, and not only the code, but the whole team moved from Los Alamos to Argonne. So this happened in 2011, and the reason for that was that Argonne got this new supercomputer Mira, and they asked us if we would be willing to move our group over there and do new physics there. So the interesting thing about Mira is that Mira was very different. It was not an accelerated machine, but it was a multi-core machine. And so there was a sister machine at Livermore, Sequoia, which was double the size of Mira. And now the challenge was that we had 1.5 million cores that we had to scale to. So quite different. So no accelerator anymore, but instead many, 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 many cores. So what we did was we took our short range solver, we replaced the algorithm by something that was much more suited towards something that was not accelerated. In this case, it's a tree algorithm. And we can talk about that after the talk a little bit more. And we also had to do some other things like the fast Fourier transform for the long range solver had to be changed. But all of this was working relatively well because the code was designed extremely well. And so we did a 3.6 trillion particle benchmark on Sequoia. And we actually made it to the Gordon Bell finalist list. So the Gordon Bell Prize is a prize that's given for high-performing supercomputing codes that solve important problems with innovative algorithms. I think that's how we can say it. So it's a big deal in the supercomputing world. And up there you see us at Argonne actually working on getting this really good performance of the code. So after that, this goes a little bit faster now. The next machine that we had access to was Titan. And Titan now finally was a GPU accelerated system. And it was a 20 petaflop system, so 20 times faster than Roadrunner. And again, it was relatively easy. We took out the short range solver, we replaced the cell-based implementation by a CUDA-based implementation, and we were ready to go. It was actually really, really quick that this happened. And more supercomputers. The one thing that, if you follow the years that I give you here, is so Titan was there in 2014. Theta and Cori were supercomputers at Argonne, as well as NERSC at Berkeley Labs. And those machines, again, were many core architectures. So we went back to our Mira implementation. We changed that a little bit. But it really took, in this case, actually just like a couple of days to move the code from the Mira implementation to the Knights Landing implementation. So really, this idea of how the code was designed worked extremely well. And then we moved back to the south. We used Summit. So Summit now is 200 petaflops. It still exists. It still runs happily. And again, so what you see here is that between 28 and 2018, we went from 1 petaflop to 200 petaflops. The code happily moved from one machine to the next. And it was really quite successful how this all worked out. One last chapter for Hack is actually the exascale era. So I said in a half sentence, in 2008, after the petaflop was actually reached, there was a report saying what would it take to get to exaflop. And so what DOE started was the exascale computing project. They actually started in 2016 to bring together 17 DOE national laboratories, universities, and industry partners to develop and prepare for exascale supercomputing. And so exascale had to be 1,000 times faster, but actually some other parts of the machine, like the memory, for example, did not go 1,000 times up from what we had on Roadrunner. So what we thought was, okay, instead of trying to push in more particles and get yet higher resolution, we want to do more physics. So we actually started and tackling the baryons. And I'm not going to talk about this much, but what we developed is, and it was actually a PhD thesis by Nick Frontieri, CRK hack, or how I like to call it, crack hack. And Nick is not happy when I say that, so don't tell him. So CRK hack actually takes advantage of the particle nature of the hack code and implements smooth particle hydrodynamics on top. And it does it in a very clever way. It's a higher order scheme to avoid some of the usual problems that SPH has, which again, I don't have time to talk about because I want to go back to something else. But just for the fun, here's a movie where you see the different components now that are in the code. So previously I showed you the movie of the dark matter, but now you also see the gas density, the temperature of the gas. So you have the whole baryonic physics in there now. So you go far beyond just gravity only. And up in the right part, you see the stars. We made them a little bit bigger so that you can actually see them. They're not as big in the simulation, really. But so the code is now forming the galaxies as well. So you have much more than just the large-scale structure in this code. And the code is running on Frontier and Aurora, which are the 2 exascale machines. Aurora is being brought up as we speak. And Frontier got the exascale label last year, actually. So again, instead of going for more resolution, more volume, we decided to go for more physics. And this is a whole talk in of itself. It's complex. So hack in pictures. So when we moved actually to Argonne and deployed hack on Mira, we found some hardware problems. So that was another very exciting story that I can tell you at some point after this maybe. And so we got an award for that because we made sure that Argonne didn't accept the machine that was actually had a problem. Here you see us preparing for the Gordon Bell paper. And this one is actually a paper, a picture with Gordon Bell, who's here. And all previous finalists. And so the one sad thing in this picture is that I'm the only woman. This still hasn't changed much. I think we have to work much harder on that to actually make a change here. But that it was in 2014 and still is. And just a little movie. So we started with this very nice code, MC2, written in a high-performance Fortran. And then all of these different architectures fell onto our heads, and we had to develop a new code hack, which is actually now a high-performance code that really works extremely well on all these different architectures and can take advantage of upcoming machines. So in the last 10 minutes, is that right? I want to connect back between theory and observations. Everything that I showed you so far was really more based on the simulations and how we have developed them. So the first thing I want to quickly say, so you saw a lot of the dark matter simulations, right? So you have your supercomputer, you generate a dark matter distribution, you measure their correlations. So what you can see here in the middle is actually a measurement. It's again from the Sloan Digital Sky survey still, where you see if you measure the correlation between these fluctuations, you really measure how the fluctuations are in this dark matter distribution. You see this, you get this red line in the middle plot. Then you measure the correlation of the galaxies in the survey, you get the measurement points that you see in black points with the error bars from the Sloan Digital Sky survey. And then what you have to do is you actually have to measure, you have to model the galaxies on top of the dark matter distribution. And the very light, and here, by the way, here you see the Sloan Digital Sky survey. This is a telescope, the data, and also the measurements. And a very simple assumption that you can make is that light actually traces mass, first approximation. So what you do is you measure the overdensities in this dark matter field. And if the overdensity is very big, populated with more galaxies. If the overdensity is very old, you populate it with red galaxies, because red galaxies are old. I'm simplifying this here a lot. But this is basically the idea behind getting from the dark matter to the galaxies without doing the full hydrodynamics simulations. And here's just a zoom in. So you see these are the halos that I'm talking about, the overdensities, which you populate with the galaxies. And what you can imagine is, if you look at the measurements, so these are the Sloan Digital Sky galaxies, and this is actually exactly the same patch of the sky taken with a telescope that mimics the resolution that we will get with the Rubin observatories. This is actually real data, it's not simulated, same patch of the sky. So you see that we can resolve a lot more with the new upcoming data. So our modeling has to be also much better. And so this is very, very simplified picture. This is again 2008, Roadrunner years. We put this very simple model on top of the dark matter distribution. And this is completely wrong. So this was a computer scientist thought like, okay, I put some blue and orange blobs into the simulation wherever the hints are. And that's why I'm calling it like an artist impression from a computer scientist. And this is where we are with this modeling today. So this is something that is called the data challenge 2. There was a data challenge 1, which was much smaller, which was generated by the dark energy science collaborations that I mentioned at the start. And so again, this is simulated data, which we made to look as close as possible to the real data as we can. I'll walk you a little bit through this. And the one thing that I want to say is, like, when I talked to you about this whole Roadrunner story, it was this email in Los Alamos that we got and said, like, here's a big challenge. This one started also off with an email in 2017, and note that it took us 4 years to get to the final published paper on this data challenge, where Phil Marshall, who was the spokesperson elect of the collaboration, asked me, do you want to take on the challenge of being the LSST desk computing and simulation coordinator? And so this time I'm not saying cosmologists are poor, I'm just saying, like, I thought it was interesting to take on a new challenge to get closer to actual data. And what Phil asked was the following. So he asked to put together with the analysis coordinator. So in desk, how it works is there's a team of roughly 10 people in the management team, it's the spokesperson and the co-spokesperson, and 3 coordinators. And so Phil Marshall asked, can you put together a team that generates a simulation that is as close as possible to actual proven observational data that we can then use to stress test data processing and analysis. And up to this point in my scientific life, my universe had been pretty pristine. There was no atmosphere in my simulations, no blurred vision results because other things of the telescopes were in there. So for me, I learned a lot in these 4 years about actual data. And it took a team of roughly 60 people, a lot of computing power in different places. And 4 years later, the final paper was published and the data was released for this data challenge 2. So let me explain a little bit more what this data challenge is about. So what we set out to do was the following, and this aim actually changed a little bit because at the beginning we were more enthusiastic or more optimistic what we could do. So in the end, what happened is we set out to do an end-to-end simulation of 5 years of observational data in 6 bands, that's not so important, but over 300 square degrees of the sky and 1 square degree of this very deep imaging data. And this is how it looks like. It's actually a real patch of the sky. So you can overlay it. I showed you at the start how it lies in the southern part of the sky. And what you have to do is you start with one of the simulations that I showed you before the movie off. So you start with a very high resolution large-scale structure simulation. This one was called the Outer Rim. It was run on the Mira supercomputer. And then you populate the simulation with realistic galaxies that have colors. And I don't have time much to explain this in detail. Shapes and also the spatial correlations are realistic. You add supernovae, and I misspelled supernova, sorry for that, active galactic nuclei, everything else from the astrophysics community that we want to put in. And then you start creating images. So you have a galaxy, you know what its properties are, and you create an image. The simulation also had the influence of the atmosphere, the telescope, everything was there. After you have generated this image data set, what you can do is you can process it with the actual processing pipelines that the Rubin Observatory has developed. And you can see if your survey looks like what we expect from LSST. For the extragalactic catalogs, this is this connection between you measure the overdensities in the simulation and you populate it with galaxies. What is very important here is to have a lot of information from different surveys. And so here we have the Zone Digital Sky survey again. Deep2 is another survey, HSC. And these span different mass scales that you have to take into consideration. So this was, again, half of a PhD thesis of one of our students to really generate this extragalactic catalog and make it look as realistic as possible. And here you just see one of the tests that we did where we actually measured a cosmological probe, galaxy clusters. And so the red dots are the clusters that we measured in the simulation. And the lines are roughly what you see in observations. So what you should take away from this is that both of them are in the same plot and have the same orientation here. After you have generated this galaxy catalog, now you have to do image simulations. And this needed, so for each galaxy, you have to now generate the image, how it will look like on the sky. And this again was a high performance computing task. One of our postdocs at that time, Sierra Villarreal, she won actually an award for generating this quite complex workflow on how to feed a supercomputer with these stamps that or galaxy input that you needed to then do for each of them an image simulation. And then finally, the whole thing looked like raw data from the telescope. We processed it in France at CCI in 2P3 with the actual pipelines that will be used to reduce the data themselves. And this is me. So at Argonne, we have this one big screen which shows what the supercomputers are doing. And so this is the Theta supercomputer that I mentioned before. And so you can see we populated it quite well. There's different colors because it was different drop sizes. And here we ran at NERSC again on Cori on 4,000 nodes. So again, it was a big supercomputing task that we had to come out. The data is publicly available, so you can download it, you can look at it. You can also, if you're part of the Rubin family, you can also look at it on the Rubin Science platform. So they are actually, so the Rubin team actually, which is running the telescope, use this data to test their science platform and access to data. And yeah, so the data sits here at the data portal at NERSC. And so now you can do exploration of the universe. So these are images from our simulated data set. So you can look at the static universe. But we also, as I said, we also have the time variable sky. And so in the simulation, you can find, here this is strongly lensed active galactic nuclei that flickers back and forth. So you can go into the data set and see if you can actually find this. And then you can do all kinds of different, and these things are still ongoing. So the community, the science collaboration is using now this data set to test out their pipelines. And so one question was, and I'm not going into details about that, like how would you bin your galaxies across different redshifts? Remember the redshifts, they were in the movie at the time. How would you bin them optimally to get the best results from weak lensing? And so this was like a machine learning challenge, and several teams submitted this, and they could use this data set because it was so realistic to actually see which one does best. And you can also do time domain science. So you can try, as I said before, so we have supernovae in the simulations, try and see if you can find them. What you see here is the signal to noise. The upper part is actually a search image, so where you try to find the supernovae. The lower part is a template that you're comparing against. And you can see how well does your finding algorithm actually work. And this paper was actually led by Sanchez et al. And it was a full end-to-end analysis of really going from these catalogs to cosmology. So they really pushed it through all the way, and they got the right cosmology in the end, which is good. So you can do a lot with these data sets. And just to summarize, I think we really have very exciting times in cosmology. We are getting really, really good data. The Vera Rubin Observatory will deliver very, very soon, hopefully, unprecedented data to study the physics of the dark universe. The Dark Energy Science Collaboration, LSST Desk, is preparing for the data arrival. And I just want to mention that everybody at the US institution can become part of LSST Desk. So if you're excited about cosmology, think about joining us. I think there's no question that the analysis of the data will be very challenging, and we really have to push current boundaries, and the simulations, I think, will be extremely helpful. I think we have really far in making these simulations look very realistic and to a point that we can use them now to test our pipelines. And but I think there's still a lot to come and lots of exciting challenges in the next years. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that talk, Katrin. Should you take questions from the audience?
Very nice work. So I'm just thinking, so compute power is not going to increase by a whole lot more, right? Maybe 10x. So what's coming in the physics or data analysis that's going to be much more impactful? Could you speak about
Right.
that?
So the one thing that the community is working on a lot right now is this one step where you go from the meta distribution to the galaxies in post-processing. So this is something that we have made a lot of progress in. It's getting better and better. The one important thing is that with the simulation that I showed you, so resolution is a big issue. Like you need a certain resolution in order to make these models work really, really well. And we have reached that kind of resolution now really in these structure simulations, structure formation simulations. And so that's one very, very active area that's still ongoing. The other area that I just touched upon in this one slide where is that we can do now more physics because Aurora and Frontier are so much faster than the previous machines. It's really the baryonic physics, the astrophysics. So implementing that, understanding that, that will allow us to push our data analysis to smaller scales. So right now, if we can't do the modeling at all scales, we have to kind of almost, I don't want to say throw away, but disregarding some of the data if we don't understand how we model it. I think that is the other very, very big challenge because just to connect back to the galaxy halo connection, that is done empirically, right, with data. Right, so it's not very predictive. So the astrophysics we want to do a little bit.
Any other questions? I have a quick one. So you ended that. So as you pointed out, and I totally see this being the trend, right? Both data and modeling is going to improve one way or another over the years. And you did highlight in your summary that a major challenge will be within the analysis. Can you say a little bit more about if it's not that, what you think the biggest challenges are in sort of like getting at dark energy and cosmology, given that we will have improved data?
Right, I think understanding all the ins and outs of our data. So I showed some of the pictures that we will see with LSST, for example. And what you might have seen is that the galaxies lie on top of each other, right? And this is a problem, as you well know, is the blending problem. Like how can we solve that? How can we make sure? Again, simulations can play a very important role, right? We can develop algorithms, and in the simulation we know how many galaxies are on top of each other and how well our algorithms actually work for that. So analyzing the switches will be a big challenge to get full information out of it. And then, as you also know, getting the distance correct for the metric redshift, that will be also another one. So there's a lot of challenges in getting the right information out of the data, doing the pipelines for the data processing fast enough and well enough. And then there's, on the other hand, us theorists and modelers to get all the physics right, to interpret the data that we then have. And this coming together, it will be very exciting, very challenging.
Awesome, thank you.